So this will be a brief presentation on the ancient Egyptian mummies of Egypt. And I'm making this video because, strangely enough, there are people on YouTube and other social media sites that claim that the ancient Egyptians were white. And at first I thought this was a joke, but then I realized that this was an actual debate amongst the black and white races of the world. And I'm not sure exactly how white people came to the conclusion that the Egyptians were white, but I assure you that this assumption was not based on any factual evidence presented by the white community. And as far as I'm concerned, and I think for most black people, I don't need any reassurance that the ancient Egyptians were black. This is just common sense. But for the sake of those who need more proof that the Egyptians were indeed black, let's examine a few things, starting with the ancient Egyptian mummies. So I'll start with this mummy because she's the most well-preserved mummy ever found in Egypt. She's been called the most perfect example of embalming from the 18th dynasty. And the Egyptians preserved her body so perfectly that they even wrapped her braids in bandages, making it possible for us to see her perfectly preserved African hair thousands of years later. And she was most likely so well preserved by the Egyptians because she was the nurse and the handmaid of Ahmose Nefertari, who was the first queen of the 18th dynasty. And this is another very well preserved mummy from the 18th dynasty. He was a Nubian prince who was buried in the Valley of the Kings in tomb KV 36. And these images show us what he looked like when he was alive. His name translates to Lion of the Battlefield. And as you can see to the top right, he is also mentioned in the Book of the Dead. And this is the mummy of Queen Ahmose Nefertari. And again, she was the first queen of the 18th dynasty. And in the Egyptian hieroglyphs, she is shown as being extremely black. And her braids are in excellent condition considering that her mummy is thousands of years old. And here's an up-close view of her braids as shown in the hieroglyphs. So it doesn't take much research for anyone to discover that Egypt and the native Egyptians were indeed black. All we have to do is look at all of the mummies that still exist to this day of the black ruling families of Egypt. And you can clearly see that even though these mummies are thousands of years old, we can still clearly see their African features and their African hair, which should be no surprise to anyone, because after all, Egypt is in Africa. So this notion that the ancient Egyptians were a white race is completely ridiculous, and it's most likely based on the mummies that have been found in Egypt with blonde hair. And the truth is that the Egyptian mummies with blonde hair were still black. Their blonde hair does not make them Caucasian, and anyone who doesn't understand this has probably never seen a black person with blonde hair, because black people with blonde hair are still present all over the world today, and they are not a new creation. They have existed since the time of ancient Egypt and probably before that. So there are two plausible explanations for black people having blonde hair. Both must be considered because both were relevant in ancient times and are still relevant today. So in ancient times, black people dyed their hair with henna. And the picture on the bottom shows Nubians with blonde hair, most likely dyed with henna. Henna will dye the hair various shades of blonde and red, and black people still use henna today, especially Muslims. And one important thing to note is that the Egyptian mummies that were found with blonde hair were all found to have evidence of henna on their hair follicles. So we clearly know why some of the Egyptian mummies had blonde hair. It was because of the use of henna. Now, aside from black people dyeing their hair with henna, there are also black people who have natural blonde hair, like the black people of Solomon Islands. They have some of the darkest skin of any black people not living in Africa, and they have the highest occurrence of blonde hair seen in any population in the world besides Europe. But according to a genetic study, their blonde hair is not the result of them mingling with Europeans. Their blonde hair is the result of a single gene mutation, one genetic trait that they carry, a gene called TYRP1. And this mutation does not appear in the European genome, so it's not European. This gene is specific to Black Melanesian people. So the DNA analysis revealed that the Black people of Solomon Islands have natural blonde hair. And here we have a scene from ancient Egypt, showing us Egyptian soldiers getting their hair done in preparation for war. And if you look closely, you'll notice that they all have blonde hair. So these ancient Egyptian soldiers would have looked very similar to the Black people found on Solomon Islands today. And Ramses was one of the kings of Egypt whose mummy was shown to have blonde hair. And Ramses' mummy has been used as the prime example to promote the idea that Egypt was white. But as I've explained, his blonde hair does not prove that he was white. In fact, the DNA analysis of Ramses' mummy proved that he was in fact a Black man. Ramses was a carrier of the E1B1A gene, which is an African gene specific to Africans and African Americans. This is a map showing the E1B1A gene distribution in Africa today. And there are too many African tribes today who carry the E1B1A gene, so I'll focus on the two main groups in Africa that have the highest concentration of the gene. The first is the Yoruba tribe, and the Yoruba tribe in Africa have roughly 44 million people. And the Bantu tribe. When it comes to the Bantu people, there are roughly 350 to 400 million of them in Africa. So together, they make up almost half of Africa's total population today, and they both carry the E1B1A gene. So the E1B1A gene is a sub-Saharan African gene, which brings me to African Americans. African Americans, like sub-Saharan Africans, also carry the E1B1A gene. And this is because Black people in America are roughly 74% sub-Saharan African, therefore sharing the same genes with the tribes in Africa and the ancient Egyptians. And the ancient connection between the Egyptian E1B1A bloodline in Africa and in the Americas is not due to slavery as some people would assume. Because as I've already explained in the Mayans Were Egyptian series, we were already here thousands of years ago, long before white people showed up. So in conclusion, there should be no question as to whether the ancient Egyptians were Black or not, because the Egyptians themselves left behind an abundance of visual evidence that proves that they were Black. And we have the ancient Egyptian mummies that have survived for thousands of years with their perfectly preserved African hair. But more importantly, we have the DNA evidence that proves not only that the Egyptians were indeed Black, but the DNA also proves that the African people still living in Africa today are the direct descendants of the Egyptians, as well as African Americans in America who belong to the very same bloodline.